From the Frankfurt School to Value Form Analysis by Helmut Reichelt. The preoccupation with problems of capital analysis began relatively early. We wanted to know in the first place what, quote, reification, end quote, really is. At that time, in the mid-60s, we systematically plagued Horkheimer with these things. We wanted to know how they are interpreted in the framework of the Frankfurt theory, since the Frankfurt theory built explicitly on them and discovered after all, after 3 sentences long silences set in, and that basically there was very little to learn from these theoreticians. Finally, we decided to think these questions through ourselves, and this can now be said in the present company, had to conclude that the omission of these moments itself had to be conceived as to a certain extent symptomatic with regard to the critique of this, quote, critical theory, end quote. This becomes evident when one pursues it further, if one may extrapolate with Habermas. One could perhaps put forward the thesis that the Habermasian theory, which after all arose in a close connection with the Frankfurt theory, is to be designated as dialectical theory, which can only develop dialectical theory formally, since it falls back to the standpoint of the bourgeois subject. Precisely that, however, is already implicitly criticized, I would suggest, in Marx's form analysis, i.e. in the value form analysis, money form analysis, and in the dialectical presentation of the categories of political economy. This implies that something like, quote, dialectical theory, end quote, as method extracted from these contents cannot be explicated. This, however, has always been the thesis of the Frankfurt theory. When one, for example, reads the writings of Alfred Schmidt, it is striking that he says that the dialectical method cannot be explicated in isolation from the contents. When one ties him down, however, tell us why don't you? What is so special about these contents? Show us the dialectical method which these contents themselves, e.g. with certain dialectical transitions in capital, normally he gives it a miss, or, at least to date, that has been the case. He was not in the position to develop the dialectical method in capital himself. To date, no one in Frankfurt has tried this as far as I can see. To Habermas, these matters are totally alien. Today, more than ever, one would have to say. When we had come a bit further, we noticed that Adorno characteristically pricked up his ears as we were confronted with these questions. As soon as he heard such explicitly dialectical formulations, as are to be found on almost every page of the Grundrisse, he developed a certain taste for the thing, but he is probably too old to follow it further. Well, that's how it all began, this preoccupation with the form analysis, and if one wants to assess what could happen in the future, that's very difficult to say, because intra-theoretically one can say that the dialectical method, proceeding from this value form analysis, makes the claim to be a method in which form and content cannot be separated from one another, and also to solve intra-theoretical problems which bourgeois economics cannot solve. This means, roughly speaking, that the standpoint of the bourgeois subject is to be seen in the fact that the bourgeois theoretician simply picks up the form externally, and himself, or herself, remains captive of this, quote, picked up, end quote, form. These are really cliches, but it seems to me to be sensible to repeat them once more, since Backhaus's work is a concretization of these questions. By contrast, Marx's theory as dialectical, positive science makes the claim to clearly conceptualize for the first time something which can be called the social totality. By dialectical theory is to be understood a dialectical development of categories in the sense of a, quote, immanent going beyond itself, end quote, if we may employ formulations which Marx used in German ideology. As opposed to this, bourgeois theory is to be criticized from the standpoint of the, quote, bourgeoisness of its theory, building in the sense of a world historical restriction of knowledge, which is itself anchored in the structure of the reproduction apparatus. Excuse me, where the fuck did I get apparatus from? Jesus Christ, I'm making up words. As opposed to this, bourgeois theory is to be criticized from the standpoint of the, quote, bourgeoisness, end quote, of its theory building in the sense of a world historical restriction of knowledge, which is itself anchored in the structure of the reproduction process. From this standpoint, one can in turn interpret this dialectical presentation as a systematic phenomenology of the restrictions to knowledge, Erkenntnisrestriktionen. That is, the totality of the forms of consciousness or forms of perception of the bourgeois subject is itself to be positively developed in the course of this dialectical presentation. Strictly speaking, we would have a two-stand argumentation. On the one hand, what we have just called, quote, positive science, end quote, borrowing a formulation from the German ideology, and on the other, simultaneously, a critique of the forms of knowledge and positive presentation of the bourgeois subject. What is the sense of discussing and coming to an understanding of these problems when that which has been written down in capital is already 100 years old? Does capital, to speak plainly, have any validity, quote, for our problems, end quote? To answer this question very briefly, we find plenty of indications that in bourgeois society certain basic problems are ever present. With his form of presentation, Marx makes the claim, in my opinion, to have presented the essence, that is, the basic structure of capitalism. This means that this form of presentation is valid as long as the object which is presented in the form of presentation itself exists. Now, capitalism hasn't disappeared, but let us suppose it were to do so. With the disappearance of the object, so too would the method of presentation of this object disappear. It is a matter of method on recall, insofar as it forms its concepts only from the standpoint of the dissolution, the Aufhebung, of that which is to be conceptualized. What are the critical epistemological implications of such a statement that this method only has validity for as long as the object presented in this form itself exists? Of course, one cannot consider this in an abstractly epistemological way. Rather, one must develop this with the presentation itself. This presentation, however, would present itself, starting from the first steps which lie before us, as a subject-object inversion, in the sense that here, in the form of the development of economic categories, which are themselves objective forms of expression of definite social relations, something like a social efflorescence, Natur voi... Nope, I'm not even going to try. Something like a social efflorescence is presented, in the sense that here something is produced by humans, comes about through their consciousness, and at the same time, quote, behind the backs of these individuals, end quote, as a, quote, natural, end quote, process. Quote, behind the backs of these individuals, end quote, is indeed one of those ever-recurring formulations which we find in Hegel and in the Frankfurt theory, but which has never been explicated as a materialist clarification of that which Hegel calls Weltgeist. This, quote, natural, end quote, process is to be understood as an overhang of social objectivity which is made by humans themselves, who are then fully subjected to this process. That is, we have this form of efflorescence the whole time, which propagates itself, we hope, for not too much longer, and for precisely as long as this overhang of objectivity propagates itself, this method of presentation is valid. Let us turn to the dialectical method of presentation itself. One finds isolated formulations in Capital, in which Marx points out that it is a matter of humans without any individuality, of character masks, of bearers of definite social relations, and that means, quote, dialectic, end quote, namely as a portrait of this abstract negation of individuals, which is itself brought about by humans. Marx presents the humans themselves only insofar as they have intercourse with one another as character masks. Insofar as they come into relation with one another as individuals, they are not the object of the theory. Insofar as they act as individuals, they withdraw from the building of theory in this specific sense. There, they anticipate something which still has to be constructed. In Capital, therefore, Marx deals only with categories in the sense of objective expressions of social relations. He talks of categories as the other, of bearers without individuality, of character masks. In a certain sense, we find here the first formulation of the concept of role, although in a quite different light from that in which it is served up by role theory. This is just a short, unsystematic introduction so that we can appreciate the perspective in which the problems are to be taken up, and from which perspective they have arisen, so that in turn we can see that it is here not a matter of an economic conceptual interpretation. The thesis for the whole reflections is the following: that only on the background of all these questions, which I have only enigmatically hinted at, can the meaning of Marx's critique of political economy be revealed.